The L88 Corvette was Chevrolet's barely legal race car for the street. The Ram Air IV GTO was Pontiac's answer to everyone who said they'd gone soft. When these two lined up in 1969, you weren't watching a drag race. You were watching $4,000 worth of difference get erased in under 14 seconds. Summer of 1969, and something's happening at drag strips that's making Chevy dealers nervous. The L88 Corvette, their $7,800 aluminum head monster, is supposed to be untouchable. It's got a 427 that everyone knows makes way more than the 430 horsepower Chevy claims. Then Pontiac shows up with a GTO carrying the Ram Air IV engine, costs $3,800 less, and suddenly those L88 owners aren't laughing anymore. Because when the tree drops, that price difference doesn't mean much if you're staring at taillights. Let's talk about what the L88 Corvette actually was, because calling it a street car is being generous. Chevrolet built this engine for one reason: to homologate it for SCCA racing. They needed to sell 50 to make it legal for competition. Everything about the L88 screamed race car. The 427 cubic inch big block came with 12.5:1 compression, aluminum heads, a radical solid lifter cam, and an 850 CFM Holley 4-barrel sitting on an aluminum intake. Chevy rated it at 430 horsepower, which was the automotive equivalent of a magician's misdirection. Everyone who dynoed an L88 found it making 560 to 580 horsepower at the crank. But here's what made the L88 barely streetable. It had no radio, no heater, no power steering in most cases. The cam was so aggressive that it idled like it was trying to shake itself apart. You needed 103 octane fuel, which meant finding a gas station that sold racing gas or adding octane booster to every tank. The engine barely ran below 3,000 RPM, making it miserable in traffic. Chevy didn't want regular customers buying these. They wanted racers who knew what they were getting into. The $947.90 price tag for the L88 option was deliberately high to scare away anyone who wasn't serious. The L88 Corvette weighed around 3,400 pounds, and with the close ratio Muncie 4-speed, it could rip through the quarter mile in the low 13-second range at over 110 miles per hour. But those were the times when everything went right, when you had the right fuel, when the engine was fully warmed up, when you launched it perfectly at 5,000 RPM without blowing the tires off. Then Pontiac showed their hand with the Ram Air IV. This wasn't some detuned street engine with a cool name. This was Pontiac's engineering department building something that could run with the L88 without requiring a chemistry degree to keep it running. The Ram Air IV started with Pontiac's 400 cubic inch block, but everything inside was different from the standard GTO. Round port heads instead of the usual D ports, a much more aggressive cam, 10.75:1 compression, and a Rochester quadrajet that actually worked in traffic. Pontiac claimed 370 horsepower, but like Chevy with the L88, they were playing the insurance game. Real dyno numbers showed the Ram Air IV making 450 to 460 horsepower. The genius of the Ram Air IV was that it gave you serious performance without making your life miserable. It would idle in traffic. It ran on pump premium, not race fuel. You could turn on the air conditioning if you wanted, though most buyers with a Ram Air IV probably weren't worried about comfort. Pontiac priced the option at $390.45, which was a fraction of what Chevy charged for the L88. You got a GTO that weighed about 3,600 pounds, which was 200 pounds heavier than the Corvette, but that weight disadvantage was offset by the price difference and the fact that you could actually drive it every day. Here's what happened when these two met at the strip. Car and driver tested both in 1969, and their numbers told a story that embarrassed some Corvette owners. The Ram Air IV GTO ran the quarter mile in 13.6 seconds at 106 miles per hour. The L88 Corvette, when it hooked up right and had everything perfect, ran 13.1 seconds at 110 miles per hour, half a second. That's the gap between a $7,800 Corvette with a race engine and a $3,900 GTO that you could drive to work. At street races and test and tune nights, the matchup created drama that went beyond the numbers. The L88 guys would show up knowing they had more power, more exotic hardware, more expensive everything. Then they'd watch a Ram Air IV GTO that someone actually drove to the track hookup and launch, and suddenly that half-second advantage didn't seem like enough return on twice the money. The GTO's slightly heavier weight actually helped it get traction off the line. The Ram Air IV's torque curve was fatter down low, which meant better 60-foot times if both drivers launched at the same RPM. The L88 had more top-end power. No question, if you stretch the race out to the 8th mile and beyond, the Corvette would start walking away. But at most street races and drag strip runs, the difference at the finish line was close enough that driver skill and launch technique mattered more than the spec sheets. A Ram Air IV with a good driver could beat an L88 with an average driver, and that reality stung for the Corvette owners who'd paid double. Hot Rod magazine ran a comparison in 1969 that tried to be diplomatic but couldn't hide the value proposition. They praised the L88 as the ultimate performance Corvette, then pointed out that for the money you saved buying a Ram Air IV GTO, you could add headers, slicks, and a shift kit and probably run even with the L88. Motor Trend tested both and concluded that the L88 was a race car that happened to have a VIN number, while the Ram Air IV was a performance street car that happened to be fast enough to run with race cars. The cultural divide between these two cars ran deeper than the drag strip. The L88 Corvette was for the guy who wanted everyone to know he was serious about going fast and had the money to prove it. No radio, no heater, race fuel only, these were badges of honor. The Ram Air IV GTO was for the guy who wanted to go just as fast but didn't feel the need to suffer for it. Air conditioning, a radio that worked, fuel you could buy at any gas station. These weren't compromises. They were proof that Pontiac's engineers knew what they were doing. Production numbers tell you everything you need to know about which approach made more sense to buyers. Chevrolet built 116 L88 Corvettes in 1969. Pontiac sold 759 Ram Air IV's GTOs that same year. The L88 was rare because it was expensive and impractical. The Ram Air IV was rare because it was the top-tier performance option, but at least you could use it. Those production numbers also meant that finding an L88 Corvette to race against was tough. Finding a Ram Air IV GTO at your local drag strip was a lot more likely. The modification potential of both engines created different communities. L88 owners were cautious about modifications because they already had a race engine. You didn't want to mess with aluminum heads and 12.5-to-1 compression unless you really knew what you were doing. Ram Air IV owners saw their engines as starting points. Headers, better carb tuning, ignition upgrades, these were bolt-on improvements that could close that half-second gap with the L88. The aftermarket supported the Ram Air IV better because more people had them and more people were willing to modify them. By 1970, both engines were gone. The L88 disappeared because Chevrolet had homologated it for racing and didn't need to sell street versions anymore. The Ram Air IV disappeared because insurance companies had figured out what Pontiac was doing, and the whole muscle car era was about to get crushed by safety regulations and fuel economy standards. But in 1969, these two represented different philosophies about how to build the ultimate performance car. The L88 Corvette was the pure expression of GM's racing heritage filtered through Chevrolet's performance division. Every compromise was in favor of going faster. Comfort, drivability, economy, these weren't even considerations. You bought an L88 because you wanted the baddest Corvette on the block and you had the skills and money to handle it. The Ram Air IV GTO was Pontiac, proving that you didn't have to choose between performance and practicality. You could have an engine that made serious power and still drive it to work on Monday. Street racers figured out pretty quickly that the L88's reputation was bigger than its actual advantage over a Ram Air IV. Sure, the L88 had more power, more exotic parts, more racing pedigree. But when money was on the line and both cars launched, that half-second gap wasn't enough to justify the massive price difference. The Ram Air IV guys knew they could run close enough to make it interesting, and on a good night with a bad launch from the Corvette, they could take the win. Looking back now, both of these engines represent the absolute peak of the muscle car era before everything changed. The L88 Corvette was the last time Chevrolet could build a street-legal race car without worrying about emissions, safety standards, or fuel economy. The Ram Air IV GTO was the last time Pontiac could pack that much power into an affordable package and sell it to anyone with the money. Within 2 years, both would be memories, replaced by lower compression engines making half the power and twice the excuses. The drag strip battles between these two weren't just about which car was faster. They were about whether exotic engineering and race-bred components were worth double the money, or whether smart engineering and practical performance could get you close enough for a fraction of the cost. The L88 said that ultimate performance required ultimate sacrifice. The Ram Air IV said you could have your cake and eat it too, as long as you didn't mind being half a second slower to the finish line. When these two lined up at the Christmas tree, it was more than a race. It was a referendum on what mattered more: bragging rights or value, exclusivity or accessibility, racing pedigree or practical performance. The fact that the Ram Air IV could run within half a second of the L88 for half the money told you everything you needed to know about Pontiac's engineering talent in 1969. The quarter-mile times are in the history books now. 13.1 seconds for the L88, 13.6 for the Ram Air IV. Half a second separating a race car from a street car. $4,000 separating two different philosophies about what performance should cost. In 1969, both were right. These days, collectors pay 6 figures for either one, which means the market figured out what drag racers knew back then. When you're this fast, the difference between first and second place doesn't matter as much as being in the race at all.